set up with the technology. It's always my pleasure to speak every year, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And I'm grateful because this community always seems to encourage me to try something new, to present on my latest research. It's not always fully baked, and so I appreciate your patience. Certainly this topic is something I've been thinking about a great deal lately. Before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge, I don't know who's in the audience because I've minimized my view, but if there are any veterans out there today, I'd really like to just acknowledge that it's Veterans Day and thank you for your service. So on Yom HaShoah, 2.5 years ago, that was April 12th, 2018, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, known as the Claims Conference, released the results of its Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Study. And I should remember to start sharing my screen so that you can see what I'm talking about. Here we go. So they released this new study 2 years ago. This was the Claims Conference, the Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Study. It was conducted in February 2018 by Schoen Consulting and was based on 1,350 interviews with American adults aged 18 and over, divided equally among landline, cell phone, and online users. The survey reported results as a representative sample of all US adults and also reported a subset of 31% of those identified as US millennials. According to their definition, that's the ages 18 to 34 at the time of the survey. So that would be those born between 1986 and 2000. And just be aware that definitionally, the Pew Research Center, for example, defines the millennial generation a little bit differently. It sees them as those born from 1981 to 1996 and calls those born 1997 and later Generation Z. That's going to come into play a little bit later in the talk. In their press release, which was titled "New Survey by Claims Conference Finds Significant Lack of Holocaust Knowledge in the United States," the Claims Conference in dramatic fashion highlighted one finding in particular. There were over 40,000 camps and ghettos during the Holocaust, and 49% of millennials cannot name a single one. It continued to present the survey's major findings, including 7 out of 10 Americans say fewer people seem to care about the Holocaust than they used to. And a majority of Americans, 58%, believe something like the Holocaust could happen again. Furthermore, it decried significant gaps in Holocaust knowledge. For example, nearly 1/3 of all Americans, 31%, and more than 4 in 10 millennials, 41%, believe that substantially less than 6 million Jews were killed, 2 million or fewer, during the Holocaust. Much hand-wringing ensued. Now, the 2018 Claims Conference survey isn't actually the subject of my talk tonight, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But it's important to point out that surveys, even methodologically sound ones, are only as good as the questions posed and the responses recorded. And individual findings should always be taken into account. For example, the finding that 7 out of 10 Americans say fewer people seem to care about the Holocaust than they used to, well, it doesn't sound so troubling to me, given that it's asking the respondents' opinion about what other people care about. Note as well that a full 96% of respondents across the board, that is no difference among millennials or the general population, 96% said yes when they were asked, some believe that the Holocaust did not happen. Do you believe the Holocaust happened? 96% said yes. And even the bombshell finding that 49% of millennials couldn't name even one camp or ghetto out of the 40,000 sites of incarceration is surely worrisome. But just be aware that it was in response to an open-ended question. The question was, during the Holocaust, Jews and many others were sent to concentration camps, death camps, and ghettos. Can you name any concentration camps, death camps, or ghettos you've heard of? In other words, those surveyed in this particular case were not given any prompts or lists of sites to choose from. Now, the question immediately prior to this one in the survey asked how the Holocaust was carried out. And it offered respondents, in this case, a list of options, as you see here: death camps, concentration camps, gassing, starvation, slave labor, death marches, shooting, medical experiments, mobile killing squads, ghettos, all of the above. Respondents could choose more than one from the list, and many must have, since if you add up the overall percentage, it comes to over 200%. And 47% of millennials responded all of the above. So again, there's some awareness of the methods of mass murder in the Holocaust, even if there is insufficient awareness of the sites of mass murder. The question before that one asked the respondents approximately how many Jews were killed during the Holocaust. And this is the question that got so many people worked up, with the Claims Conference reporting that nearly 1/3 of all Americans, 31%, and more than 4 in 10 millennials, 41%, believe that substantially less than 6 million Jews were killed, 2 million or fewer, during the Holocaust. But note the choices available. Let me get out my pointer here. Right, look at the choices. 20 million, but then 6 million, then down to 2 million, then 1 million, etc. That's to say, respondents were not given any options between 2 million and 6 million to choose, nor between 6 million and 20 million. I'm sure there's a reason for this. I don't pretend to know how to write a survey question. So the fact that respondents weren't given an option like, well, 5 million or 10 million, or any of the other numbers people might guess, could certainly have a reasonable explanation. And I know I personally would have liked to see more people choose 6 million as the answer. But I'm not certain what this tells us. Perhaps it tells us only that Americans have trouble visualizing very large numbers. We get a sense from reviewing the 2018 Claims Conference survey that general knowledge about and interest in the Holocaust is not so concerning, but specific awareness of the historical and geographical details of the Shoah is lacking, and possibly even declining. To be sure, I'm not troubled by the fact that 20% of all respondents and 35% of millennials said they were not sure when asked an open-ended question about what Auschwitz was, and that another 21% and 31% respectively answered something other than concentration, death or extermination, or forced labor camp. I'm just not sure this means Americans aren't learning about the Holocaust, or that things have changed very much. There was an article published in Slate in response to the Claims Conference report and the media coverage of it, particularly the New York Times coverage. That article cited polls from the 1980s and 90s collected by historian Peter Schulman. And Schulman turned up some very similar findings. For example, in 1985, he cited a poll that found that 32%, or a third of respondents, said they weren't sure or volunteered the wrong answer when asked what is or was the Holocaust. And in responding to questions about the numbers of dead, a quarter of the respondents in a poll from 1992 also guessed 2 million Jews or fewer had been killed. 10% guessed 20 million. 20% chose not to answer. Now, I don't know what the choices were then, but it's comparable to what the Claims Conference found in 2018. The same year, in 1992, 38% of respondents could not identify Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka as concentration camps. And this is notable because these respondents were given these names on a list to jog their memories. And also, I just want to note that there were some bright spots in the Claims Conference study from a couple of years ago. For example, about 2/3 of millennials first heard about the Holocaust at school, and 89% of them remember first hearing about it between the ages of 5 and 17. 88% across the board believe Holocaust education should be compulsory. And 93% think students should learn about the Holocaust while at school. So everybody thinks Holocaust education is a good thing. Everybody seems to remember, many people, even millennials, seem to remember learning about it. Well, in March of this year, the Claims Conference commissioned another study called the US Millennial Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Study. This time they surveyed 1,000 US millennials, just a little bit fewer than the previous time, and also differentiated between millennials and Generation Z. And they also drilled down to the state level, recording responses from an additional oversample of 200 people in that same age group from each state. That is 200 from each of 50 states, plus 1,000 nationwide. So a total sample of 11,000 for the entire study. So a very robust study. Not surprisingly, given the 2-year span between the surveys, the national results were more or less the same. There was a marked shift in responses to the open-ended question, what was Auschwitz? Which now permitted multiple responses. Now only 26% said they were not sure, compared to 35% previously. And only 17% said something other than concentration, death, or extermination, or forced labor camp. That was a full 31% for millennials in the previous national survey just 2 years earlier. That is to say that a total of 64%, let me draw you a circle here, a total of 64% did identify Auschwitz as a concentration or death or extermination camp in 2020, compared to 33% of millennials in 2018. Now, interestingly, the results from this year pretty much match the results 2 years ago for this question for all respondents at 63%. So I wonder if maybe more millennials and Gen Z respondents 2 years later have learned the word Auschwitz. Or I wonder if maybe all of the media coverage of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in January 2020 might have had an impact. Or even all of the press about millennials not knowing what Auschwitz was 2 years earlier helped them essentially learn the word over a fairly short 2-year period. A new question in 2020 asked if respondents had seen Holocaust denial or distortion on social media or elsewhere online, and almost half said yes in the national survey. But what was more revealing in this year's survey was the state level data. We obviously cannot go over all of this data in detail. And again, I'm still just warming up to the main topic. So I thought we might just briefly look at the Florida data. Most of it matches up more or less with the national survey responses, with a couple of important distinctions. One is on the open-ended Auschwitz question. In the national sample, you will recall, 64%, that's the previous 63 plus also the forced labor number, 64% identified Auschwitz as a concentration or death or extermination camp. Sorry, that's actually no, that's just the first two categories. Let me adjust that. Oops. Here we go, those numbers. In the Florida survey, only 49% did the same. In the national survey, 26% weren't sure. While in the Florida version, 45% were not sure what Auschwitz was. So this is troubling. In Florida, we also see an increase in those who have seen Holocaust denial or distortion on social media or elsewhere online. You recall that there were almost 50% of the national survey, that was really 49%, who said they'd seen it. In Florida, it goes up to 57%. And finally, I do want to note that 90% of Florida respondents learned about the Holocaust in elementary, middle, and or high school, and plus another 7%. So almost all of the respondents either remember that they learned about it, or plus another 7% that weren't sure if they learned about it. This finally brings us to our topic. That is to say that the overwhelming majority of millennial and Generation Z respondents in Florida and national, 90% or more, say they learned about the Holocaust in school, but the actual recall of Holocaust facts when surveyed is poor, and the amount of misinformation is concerning. The Claims Conference presented these findings somewhat dramatically in a press release on September 16th, timed, I would assume, to receive attention on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. More hand-wringing. The major state-by-state findings are available in a handy tool on the Claims Conference website, which features a color-coded map. And by the way, in case this looks sort of familiar, it doesn't mean that the whole country has turned into red states, but it's just that they happen to use a color coding that leads people to think that everything is turning red. It's a color-coded map recording 8 key metrics that you can see across the top of this screen grab. For example, the responses to the question, approximately how many Jews were killed during the Holocaust, selected from the list of options cited previously, is rendered on the map as a negative, right? As people who did not know 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. So this tool allows a viewer to see how states compare on the map, question by question, right? You see Florida here at 61%. In case you're interested, New York, 60%. California, 59%. So you can see how states compare on the map, question by question. And the tool also allows us to see the response percentages all at once by hovering over the state, so that here is the summary of the survey's key metrics for Florida. Now, I think we can argue that the way the information is presented can be a little misleading at times. For example, regarding the 6 million question, which we've talked about already. We already discussed the choices respondents were given and the absence of options between 2 million and 6 million, or between 6 million and 20 million. But there's also the issue that the 6 million Jews, sorry, that that the 61% who did not know 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust obscures the 39%, right, the balance, who did know and did answer 6 million when they were asked. Or the presentation of the 31% who believe 2 million or fewer Jews were killed obscures that previous 39% who answered 6 million, as well as the 12% who answered 20 million, and also the 18%, almost 1 in 5, who said they weren't sure. They saw all the options, all the different numbers, and they just weren't sure. They didn't check any number. But all of that is not to deny that there's some disturbing findings in the survey data. Most prominently, the responses to the question, who or what do you think caused the Holocaust? This was an open-ended, multiple response question. You could answer anything, and you can answer more than one thing. And it was asked only of those who had definitely heard or think they had heard of the Holocaust. That's about 90% of the sample. And very disturbingly, 11% of national respondents and 13% of Florida respondents, when asked who or what do you think caused the Holocaust, said Jews. That's a problem. In order to further assess Holocaust literacy, the claims conference in this year's state-by-state survey calculated what they called a Holocaust knowledge score, geared at comparing levels of knowledge and awareness in each state relative to one another. The Holocaust knowledge score, as they calculated, is equivalent to the percentage of respondents, 18 to 39, in each state who meet the following criteria. One, that they have definitely heard about the Holocaust. The two, they can name at least one concentration camp, death camp, or ghetto. And three, they know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Okay, so this seems very reasonable at first glance, right? I mean, I just said that a full 90% had definitely heard about the Holocaust, and we know that 39% checked 6 million Jews to the answer, how many were killed. So, it sounds like something that would be a reasonable thing to expect, that someone would be able to know all those three things as a kind of minimum metric for Holocaust awareness. But I just want to point out, and this is something I've learned from my colleagues in the library, this kind of a correlation is a lot like a Venn diagram. When you're doing a library search, for example, and you want to put 3 different things together with an and, it means that you're only searching for the 3 things when they all are found together. And so you're really only looking at this small area of intersection. And I've tried to draw the diagram here according to the national percentages in the 2020 study. So the definitely heard about the Holocaust. Oh, I had said 90% before, but here it's 78%. So I must have made a mistake there. 52% could name at least one camp, and the 37% that know that 6 million Jews were killed. Now, Florida, unfortunately, scored nearly at the bottom of the Holocaust knowledge score. It scored 48th out of 50 states. Only Mississippi and Arkansas scored lower. And the Holocaust knowledge score for Florida was 20% in meeting all the designated criteria. Lest you think that that is just really, really shocking, I want to put into context that even the highest scoring state, right, the top score, you could put into the chat what you want to guess that would be, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to say it was Wisconsin. The highest scoring state with the highest scoring Holocaust knowledge score was Wisconsin with 42%. I think most of us would consider that a failing grade. So no one did very well on this. And what is more, the state-by-state surveys were conducted in some places that have mandated Holocaust education. Florida, for example, has had a K through 12 state mandate since 1994. And that ostensibly required all public school districts to teach about the Holocaust. Now, this mandate was revised and updated this year, and I'm going to get back to that in my conclusions. I was curious to see how the high and low scoring states on the Holocaust knowledge score measure correlated with states that have Holocaust education mandates. And this is the list of the states that require some Holocaust education in secondary schools, as reported and tracked by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. None of the top 10 states in the Holocaust knowledge score rankings appear on this state mandate list, including Wisconsin, the #1. And what is more concerning, 3 of the bottom 10 states do appear on the state mandate list: Delaware, Florida, and New York. Granted, some of the mandated states have only recently legislated and approved the mandate, and support for and enforcement of state mandates vary very widely. So we can quibble about the survey methodology and its very possibly alarmist presentation, but it's certainly clear from this study at least that the millennial and Generation Z in the US have not learned enough of the particulars about the Holocaust, and that a troubling minority are misinformed about some of what we would consider the most basic facts. Clearly, if the measure of whether Holocaust education works or not is whether a majority of adults 18 to 39 can meet the Holocaust knowledge score metric, everyone has failed. It's enough to make you want to give up. But the question is this an accurate picture? Curiously, right at the same time the 2020 Claims Conference US Millennial Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Survey was released, another survey was also published. This one was commissioned by Echoes and Reflections, which is a joint project of the ADL, the USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem. This US college survey obtained data from 1,500 students aged 18 to 24 in 4-year colleges and universities, seeking to explore the relationship between exposure to Holocaust education in high school and subsequent student attitudes and behaviors in US college campuses. A key aspect of the study was distinguishing between those who received Holocaust education in high school, which was 79%, or almost 4 out of 5, and those who didn't. The 79% of respondents who did learn about the Holocaust in high school generally learned about it for anywhere between 1 day and 1 month. Now, the Echoes and Reflections survey specifically cited the 2018 Claims Conference study, particularly its finding that millennials especially lacked historical knowledge about the Holocaust. And the Echoes and Reflections survey noted both an increase since 2018 in state and national efforts to support Holocaust education. That may be, by the way, why the percentage that could identify Auschwitz went up. And they also noted an increase in anti-Semitic violence worldwide, which could also have an impact on the results. Overall, the Echoes and Reflections study found that students who had received Holocaust education displayed more pluralistic and tolerant attitudes by about 10 percentage points over their peers who had not, as well as a greater willingness to challenge and engage with intolerant behavior, at least in private. I want to just jump to the conclusions of the Echoes and Reflections study. And they wrote, This study provides strong evidence of the positive impact of Holocaust education on students' attitudes towards diversity, tolerance, and upstander behavior in the face of hate and intolerance. Importantly, it shows that these outcomes are sustained over time, appearing in students who have left high school and are transitioning into young adulthood. It also provides strong evidence that the use of survivor testimonies, I think something like 55% of those surveyed had uh, heard either live or recorded Holocaust testimony in their high school Holocaust education, whether in person or digitally. And the evidence that use of survivor testimonies may be even more effective at developing these positive attributes in students. These findings have important implications for education policy and practice discussions. This is especially true for decisions on how to most efficiently and impactfully deliver Holocaust education to cultivate citizenship values, empathy, respect for differences, and willingness to take action against hate and prejudice in today's challenging political and social environment. It would appear that we have two very different pictures of the state of Holocaust education in the 21st century, particularly among Gen Z. One would suggest they gained little knowledge and awareness from their high school exposure to the Holocaust, while the other proposes that those who learned about the Holocaust in high school are, frankly, better citizens. Whenever we ask a question, does Holocaust education work? We have to think about what we're really asking. What do we mean by work? What do we mean by education? What is the goal of Holocaust education? Is it to make sure that everyone knows that 6 million Jews were murdered? Is that what I want people, my colleagues, my students, random strangers in the street? Is that what I want people to know about the Shoah and the experiences of my co-religionists? To know about my community's history? And what will that knowledge accomplish? Will it lead to less anti-Semitism in the country, in the world? Shouldn't the goal indeed be a reduction in anti-Semitic behavior, an increase in tolerance, empathy, and respect? Education is or should be about outcomes. What outcomes do I want to see in my students? Let's consider the question of the location of the Holocaust, for example. In the 2020 Claims Conference survey, question was asked, in which country or countries listed below, well, to the side on my PowerPoint, did the Holocaust take place? So 70% of respondents selected Germany and 31% selected Poland. And respondents could select as many countries as they wanted, including, if you look all the way down, there's an all of the above category down here. So Germany and Poland were the first two countries listed. And that might have something to do with the preponderance of responses that answered Germany or Poland. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is, if my goal is for students to know where mass murders occurred, then this is a terrible outcome, since none of the death camps were located in Germany, and all were located in Poland. But if my goal is to teach about the rise of Nazism and the development of Nazi policies towards Jews and towards Poles, if my goal is to teach why none of the death camps were in Germany and why all were in Poland, this isn't a bad start. It invites a discussion about Nazi territorial ambitions, about European anti-Semitism, and about what we mean by the word Holocaust itself. Are we referring to death camps? Are we referring to ghettos and deportations? Are we referring to Nazi policy? What is it that we mean? So the knowledge referenced by the responses to questions like this one is not so much, I think, an indicator of awareness as it is a snapshot of some basic public perceptions in a given population. And educators can work with those perceptions. There was a lot of chatter about the two different surveys immediately following their release. The Claims Conference survey renewed many fears about rising anti-Semitism, declining Holocaust awareness, and the general state of public education in the US. But many expressed concerns that the Echoes and Reflections survey received virtually no media attention. This view was best summarized in an op-ed in the foreword by Stephen Smith, executive director of the USC Shoah Foundation. That was one of the Echoes and Reflections survey's co-sponsors. In his piece titled, "Stop the Fear Mongering, Holocaust Education is Good and It Works," Smith asked how the more widely covered survey produced such different results. And he said, it didn't really. I'm quoting, "Both found that respondents believe Holocaust education is important and should be taught in schools. Both found that respondents believe learning the history of the Holocaust will keep something like it from happening again. Both argue that teachers need training and support to teach effectively about the Holocaust." So Smith criticized the Claims Conference for really scaring people by setting a rigid standard for Holocaust awareness, and then when it wasn't met, implying young adults' lack of specific knowledge about the Shoah revealed a certain degree of anti-Semitism. He said, denying facts about the Holocaust is anti-Semitism. Not knowing facts about the Holocaust is not, although it is a sad indictment of our society. Let's say Jews were surveyed and it was found that a large number did not know the number of African slaves that were brought to this continent. Would that make Jews racist? Don't reach for Google. So a main point of Smith's op-ed is that knowledge is not the same thing as understanding, and that the latter must be our ultimate goal in Holocaust education. And all of that is to say that facts do not teach by themselves. Since the early days of my career, I've been concerned with this issue when it comes to the Shoah. Why is it that we, Jews especially, but also lots of other people, why is it that we often assume that the facts of the Holocaust are so compelling that simply presenting them to students will produce the desired outcomes? Unless perhaps the desired outcomes are indeed that others know the facts of Jewish persecution, and not just in Europe from 1933 to 1945. In other words, maybe that's all we really want people to know. Last year, an interesting research opportunity presented itself. Every year, FIU assigns all incoming first-year students a common reading as part of a course called the First Year Experience. Last year, the book was Determined, a Holocaust survivor's memoir, written by Martin Baranek, whom many of you may know, with Lisa Cicero. And my colleague Becky, Christ, and I propose that we study the experience, impact, and relevance of reading and teaching the book Determined in such a setting. And the setting is interesting because it's a general education course with an assigned Holocaust-related reading last year, in which students have enrolled not due to an interest in the Holocaust. It's an amazing sample. It's an amazing potential set of respondents who are all required to read a Holocaust memoir, not in the context of a Holocaust education experience. And if you know anything about FIU and the size of FIU, this was really a great opportunity because the first year experience is a course that last year was taken by over 2,000 students and taught by nearly 900 instructors. That's just in fall and spring. That doesn't even include the summer cohort, which is at least another 1,000. 127 students and 48 instructors completed at least part of the survey. And not surprisingly, 76% of student respondents either agreed or somewhat agreed with the statement, "I'm more informed about the Holocaust now than before I read Determined." 87% discussed the book in class, which was to be expected because they were supposed to be learning about it in class. But we were also interested to see that 64% discussed it with other FIU students outside the classroom, and 62% discussed it with family and friends outside FIU, which we're thinking might be an indicator of their interest in the topic. Additionally, in a finding similar to the Echoes and Reflections study, 91% of students either agreed or somewhat agreed with the statement, "Reading the book made me aware of other perspectives beyond my own." And 77% said they had taken lessons from reading Determined into their personal lives. Lastly, in response to the statement, "I found Martin's experience relevant to my personal life," 60% of students either agreed or somewhat agreed. Now, in this case, we asked for an open-ended follow-up. We asked, "Please describe how you found his experience personally relevant or not." And we're still unpacking the responses, but anecdotally, I can note that a little over half of the respondents described some level of relevance as I'm understanding their responses, many of them in terms of their immigration experience. And about 1/3 of the respondents largely rejected any relevance due to the radically different circumstances of author and student. So here are just some examples from the open-ended responses. First, the relevance group, for example, it had many themes that related to my experiences: fear, immigration, determination, family, loneliness, etc. Many students, including myself, can relate to all of these themes. Or the third one, of course, his life was completely different than mine, and to compare the two would be ignorant. However, my parents and I can relate to his determination, finding a better life as my family and I fled to Cuba to do the same. In the not or less relevant category, we could note that responses like, "My life could never compare to the tragedies of the Holocaust," "I feel as though I haven't experienced anything truly traumatic, therefore I didn't entirely relate," or my favorite, the last one, "I find it difficult to relate my life to that of someone going through a genocide of their people and months of endless torture and pain, both physically and emotionally. I'm just a student." These limited findings are encouraging. Students appear to see relevance and personal lessons in reading a Holocaust survivor's memoir, recounting his own perseverance and luck, and they overwhelmingly, granted it's a small sample, but they overwhelmingly credit the book with broadening their perspective. This year, we're surveying students and instructors in the course a second time to see how reading a non-Holocaust related book compares. And this year's reading is about it's an immigrant experience book, a book by Reina Grande. So we're very curious to see, after our spring results come back, how they compare. In lieu of a conclusion, I want to briefly return to the state of Florida and the recently revised 1994 mandate. Among other changes, these revisions require the Florida Department of Education to prepare and offer Holocaust education standards and curriculum. Remarkably, the original mandate never called for the creation of any. This summer, as Rabbi Weinstock noted, I was invited to serve as a member of an expert group of 10. I'm the only university professor on the team. Drafting these standards, and while the work of the group deserves a talk of its own, I mention it because it's a hopeful sign of progress. The draft benchmarks we proposed to Commissioner Kerkoren not only outline key aspects of Holocaust knowledge, but also define a progression of essential concepts related to anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice, to propaganda, empathy, civic responsibility, remembrance, and more. Hopefully, the new standards and the curriculum to accompany them will provide guidance context, and resources for teachers throughout the state, not only on what Florida high school graduates should know, but also on what they should understand, leading to them to define, analyze, and apply the lessons of the Holocaust as relevant to their own lives and the lives of their communities, so that Holocaust education will work for them and for all of us. So I thank you. My contact information is there, and I'm very happy to take questions. I'm going to stop my screen share, expand my view so I can see more of you. And look in the chat.